Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. We are the Group 4, presenting the topic Utilitarianism by John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill was a British philosopher, political economist, and social reformer known for his influential contributions to various fields, including ethics, political theory, and economics. One of his famous works is Utilitarianism, published in 1863, where he elaborates on the ethical theory of utilitarianism. So, what is utility? Utility is also known as the greatest happiness principle. Actions are deemed morally right if they tend to promote happiness. Otherwise, they are wrong if they produce the reverse of happiness. Hence, utilitarianism is a theorized and widely accepted theory of morality. However, for some critics, the end of life is feeling and purpose, which is a noble pursuit expected from humans rather, compared to utility, where they deem it as a doctrine for peace. Which is why in this principle, pleasure and freedom from pain are the desirable ends. So to define and defend utilitarianism, John Stuart Mill laid out several aspects or situations for further understanding. So first is the higher and lower pleasures. For Mill, quality of pleasure plays an important role. Human beings have higher faculties than animals. For those who accuse the Epicureans, making utility as a basis for morality puts human nature into degrading light, since it is being implied that humans are only capable of pleasure, the same way pigs are. However, this is not the case, as an animal's pleasure does not satisfy the human conception of happiness. As a rebuttal, human appetite draw pleasure from experiences, and once they become conscious of it, they do not regard anything that does not cause happiness, unlike animals. However, the basis for a pleasure possessing a high faculty is sometimes arbitrary and not its intensity, which is why Stuart Mill believes that animal pleasure must also be respected. On top of that, John Stuart Mill believes that the value of happiness should not be solely dependent on the quantity or how much we experience it. Quality of pleasure is also a crucial factor in human satisfaction. Assuming that a human is acquainted with two stimuli that produce pleasure, the quality of pleasure will depend on which among the two has less discontentment. Therefore, the other stimulus have more discontentment and would not equalize the quality of the first stimulus even if humans were to experience the second stimulus several times. People with higher pleasure largely contribute to the greatest happiness for greatest number of people. In most occasions, people with higher pleasures are happier than those who don't grasp the significance of utility. This is because the utilitarian standard is not the greatest amount of happiness for an agent, but the greatest number of people altogether. Therefore, even if a person with nobility feels less happiness by acting upon such noble things, those actions would still bring pleasure for other people. So next, through utility, men can prevent a sense of unhappiness. Several critics have argued that happiness should not be the rationale of human life. It is said that men can do anything even without happiness. Hence, even if it is true, utilitarianism does not only give happiness to men, but also to lessen their unhappiness. In addition to this, John Stuart Mill added that humans' simultaneous actions in survival must need a rationale for motivation. Furthermore, happiness plays a significant role in human survival as it avoids men taking refuge in unhappiness and the potential aftermath it may bring. If we are going to relate that in real life scenarios, um, we can relate that to the rampant cases of suicide recorded worldwide. The best way to have a satisfied life is through tranquility and excitement. Happiness is not a continuous state of highly pleasurable excitement. Exalted pleasure lasts only a few moments, and oftentimes, happiness is interrupted due to some circumstances. John Stuart Mill also argued that if people are all taught to consider happiness as the end of life, they will not be satisfied with only just a moderate share of it. Meanwhile, there will also be some who can be satisfied with much less. Moreover, through tranquility, humans can be contented with less pleasure. On the contrary, the excitement of the person can also experience happiness, but excitement can be proportional to the pain he or she can experience. Although these two concepts are not complementary, but they are considered as men's natural allies. This also illustrates how men hold on through hardships before earning happiness or satisfaction, which is very much alike to the phrase calm before the storm. And lastly, mental cultivation and unselfishness are also prime requirements towards happiness. In some cases, deriving pleasure from the pursuit of happiness instigates selfishness within oneself. But with Stuart Mill's utilitarian system, he believed that if our minds are cultivated in being open to a fountain of knowledge, men will be programmed to seek pleasure in everything as they will always find inexhaustible sources of interest in everything. In the long run, mental cultivation allows the realization of individuals that the existence of positive evils and bad laws are the calamities that men must fight against. And in John Stuart Mill's utilitarian system, sacrifice is the highest virtue of a man. While we live in an imperfect world with imperfect conditions, sacrificing one's happiness for the happiness of others is a conscious and virtuous action that any man can commit. As discussed a while ago, the existence of positive evil and bad laws drives enviousness towards the state of other people. But by a man's willingness to sacrifice, it manifests that he has broken free from anxiousness about the evil of life. John Stuart Mill related the ethics of utility to the golden rule of Jesus of Nazareth, where he proclaimed, "Love your neighbors as you love yourself." To become a benevolent utilitarian is to realize that utilitarian standards do not only mean the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people, but also to recognize how human beings sacrifice their own greatest good for the good of others to collectively experience the greatest good altogether. And John Stuart Mills has suggested practical ways to constitute the ethics of utility. There are two: laws and social arrangements, which should place the happiness or interest of every individual as much as possible in line with the interest of the whole. And then afterwards, education and opinion will follow. This molds human character due to the fact that learning the ethics of utility equips oneself to become an agent of promoting the general good. In turn, this will become instilled in his habits, and that the essence of utility will play a vital role in every man's sentient existence, particularly with their social interaction.
Setting the standard too high. One major objection is that utilitarianism demands too high a moral standard, that people must always act purely from duty and consideration of the general social good. But this reflects a misunderstanding. Objectors confuse rule of action with motive of acting. Rule of action is the general moral guidelines and duties set forth by utilitarianism, which is maximizing utility, with motive of acting, which is the internal motivations and personal reasons why an individual carries out a specific action. Utilitarianism defines our duty but it does not require making duty our only motive. In reality, most of our good actions have other driving factors: relationships, kindness, and self-interest. We should aim to cultivate these beneficial motivations. Utilitarianism evaluates actions based on following the rule. It does not require the motive to always be duty or maximum utility. Consider someone who risks themselves to save a drowning person. This would strike most as heroic even if the part of their motivation was hoping for a reward. The utilitarian view is not laser focused on parsing motives. The moral value is in the action itself and its life saving consequences. High standards, yes, but room for human imperfection. Furthermore, utilitarianism is concerned first with improving the lives and well being of individuals. Our daily opportunities to create positive impact are usually focused on helping people around us, not abstract concepts of society. Setting the utilitarian bar high does not mean always acting for humanity wide benefit. The utilitarian view of moral duty does not require constant focus on improving society as a whole. For most people, the priority is promoting the happiness and interests of individuals they directly interact with. This is what we call private utility. The only exception is those few with widespread influence. Even when acting for private benefit, utilitarians must avoid violating the rights and expectations of others. The thought process is, if everyone did this, would there be harm? General welfare is most relevant for acts we morally refrain from, despite particular benefit. The thought is, if universally practiced, would this act be harmful? But overall, utilitarianism demands no more public thought than any ethical system. Its emphasis remains on maximizing the happiness of a particular individual through most moral decisions. This summarizes the appropriate scope of moral concern under utilitarianism, from private to public, for the typical moral agent. Is utilitarianism chilly? Critics of utilitarianism often accuse it of making people chilly and unsympathetic by neglecting moral feelings towards individuals. The doctrine is said to focus so strongly on the consequences of actions that it ignores personal virtues and relationships behind them. However, this criticism misses the mark for a couple of reasons. First, no coherent ethical standard judges the morality of an action based solely on the personality or character of the person doing it. A kind person can still act wrongly in a particular situation, just as someone with an unpleasant personality may end up doing the right thing. Second, personal virtues like kindness or courage or wisdom apply primarily to our overall estimation of a person's character, not the rightness or wrongness of their action. Utilitarianism acknowledges that there are many admirable qualities beyond just behaving morally, but it maintains the best evidence of a good character is right conduct over time. In fact, utilitarianism values empathy, integrity, and other virtues precisely because they motivate doing good. It recognizes that developing a morally well-rounded character is key to consistently promoting happiness through one's actions. The doctrine is nuanced enough to weigh both rightness of actions as well as the emotions and motivations behind them. For example, suppose someone tells a white lie to protect another person from harm. Lying is ethically wrong by utilitarian standards, but the compassion behind it reflects the moral depth of a character. This shows utilitarianism has enough nuance to identify both the wrongness of the act itself and the virtue of the motivation behind it. So while firmly focused on outcomes, utilitarianism allows room for broader human sympathies and appreciation of moral character. It is compatible with emotionality, integrity, and nuanced analysis of acts versus underlying virtues. So, in summary, while utilitarianism does not eliminate all disagreements on ethics, it does not cause it either, and it furnishes a systematic, understandable technique for resolving moral differences through assessment of likely results. This means different moral opinions are not a true basis to critique utilitarian doctrine itself. Next is utilitarianism as godless. Perhaps the strongest objection against utilitarianism is calling it godless doctrine incompatible with faith traditions. However, for those who see God's essential nature as benevolent, just, and desiring human fulfillment, utilitarianism actually meshes very well theologically. Seeking the greatest good for the greatest number clearly aligns with theological focus on justice, compassion, and human happiness as God's fundamental will. Utilitarianism does not negate or oppose divine revelation or scripture. Rather, it sees sacred texts as providing moral guidance, not as an inflexible set of detailed commandments to follow, regardless of real-world outcomes. Scripture tends to lay out broad, general principles for living an ethical life, not absolute universal rules to rigidly adhere to it in every circumstance. In practice, utilitarians can point to religious teachings as evidence to highlight the utility and wisdom of a certain course of action, just as adherents of any faith tradition can. For utilitarians, sacred texts are part of the body of evidence supporting what promotes overall welfare, not the sole decider of right and wrong. So utilitarianism is not at all opposed to religion or scripture. For those who see God as desiring justice and human fulfillment, utilitarianism allies closely with divine will. It incorporates revelation as moral guidance, not unbending law. And it can cite religious teachings as we support for actions promoting utility and happiness. Utilitarianism is thus highly compatible with many theological perspectives focused on compassion and human flourishing.
Now let's go on with expediency. Utilitarianism is often slapped down as an immoral doctrine by giving it the name expediency and taking advantage of the common use of that term to contrast it with principle. Expedient is supposed to right. It usually refers to actions that benefit a person's specific or own interest, such as when he or she disregards the interests of the whole just to maintain his or her position. Like for example, a high official who disregarded the interests of the many in order to protect or save himself. Anything more than this indicates that it is being used in violation of a rule whose compliance is considerably more efficient in order to achieve a short-term goal. In this sense, where being expedient is already used at its maximum, then we can say that expedient in here is already a branch or the same thing as the hurtful and not the same thing as the useful. For instance, it is more convenient to lie in order to get out of a messy situation or get something that would benefit us or others right away. However, being able to trust one another is the primary foundation of all social well-being, and the lack of trust hinders everything that fulfills human happiness for all. Therefore, the most important is for us to have a growth of our sensitive sense about honesty within ourselves, such that if that honesty weakens, then that is and can be one of the most harmful. Moreover, any deviation from truth, even if we did not mean to do it, will still negatively affect our trustworthiness. For these reasons, we can say that it is not expedient or immoral to break such a rule in order to gain an immediate advantage. But if a person contributes to humanity's downfall, might be by harming them or depriving them of benefits, is the real and should be considered as the worst enemy. All moralists agree that there is still an exception in telling the truth for reasons that could save an individual from harm, and the only way to save him or her is to lie about it. For For example, for medical reasons. Let's say I have a heart condition. Then my family were informed that I only have a few days to live. So in order for me to not be overly stressed about it, they will lie and say that everything is going okay. Of course, if I get stressed over the news, there's a bigger chance that my condition will worsen. And that's the least that my family would want to happen. So in order to protect me, they chose to lie. But in order for that lying to not worsen beyond what is necessary, then it should be acknowledged, and if possible, there should be boundaries set, such that if the principle of utility is good at anything, it should also be able to compare conflicting utilities and identify the areas which dominate. Next, time to calculate. It is stated that defenders of utility are always challenged to respond whenever people say that before acting, one doesn't have time to calculate and weigh the effects on the general happiness of any line of conduct, which is also the same as saying that before acting, one does not have the time to read the Bible, making it impossible to be guided by Christianity. But there is an answer to that, because in reality, there has been plenty of time, because throughout history, humanity has learned by experience what kinds of repercussions acts are like to have, which is the foundation of all morality and prudence. The objectors speak as though the beginning of this experience had been put off until now, making a man begin to question if murder and theft are detrimental to human happiness the moment he feels tempted to meddle with them and not from the outset. If humanity agrees that morality is determined by utility, they would know what is useful and teach it to their children, and make laws and social norms about it. So, even if someone were to argue that this is how things work, it would not be very difficult concept to understand. Any ethical standard can be ineffective if associated with ignorance, but on any hypothesis, and by this time, humanity should have already acquired positive beliefs about the effects of certain actions on happiness. These beliefs serve as moral guidelines for people and philosophers until something better is discovered. Moreover, there are assertions about this, such as philosophers might easily find something better even now on many subjects, that the accepted code of ethics is not God-given, and that mankind still has much to learn about how various kinds of action affect general happiness. Because the corollaries from the principle of utility can be improved indefinitely as the human mind is progressing, they are constantly improving. However, considering intermediate moral standards and approval is one thing. Ignoring them totally and attempting to test each particular behavior directly by the first principle is another. It's weird to think that having a fundamental principle contradicts having secondary ones. For example, a traveler asks for directions and you tell him the way, but then you are not also banning him from using other landmarks and signs on the way. The idea that happiness is the main objective of morality does not mean we should not have other rules to help us get there or suggest which way to go. Also, people should stop talking nonsense about morality, because as we face more dilemmas in life, we already know which is right or wrong beforehand and having an understanding about morality. And we can assume that people will keep doing this as long as foresight continues to be human quality. More importantly, we still need secondary principles in adopting the fundamental principle of morality, as it guides us to be better in understanding our principle correctly. Next, bad faith. Bad faith states that the remaining objections to utilitarianism primarily focus on blaming it for the common flaws in human nature and the general issues that affect morally upright people as they shape their lives. But in the case of a utilitarian, he believes that his own decisions are an exception to moral rules. And if he do immoral things, then he will still most likely to look at the benefits of it rather than not doing it at all. But the truth is, utilitarianism is not the only excuse to do bad things, since there are other doctrines that acknowledge and justify things that oppose morality. But since human affairs are complex, we cannot fully say which standards should be an exception, considering that there are only few things known to be right or wrong. Most importantly, faith is not to be blamed for this. Every ethical belief allows a person to adapt his behavior to fit any situation, but this could also risk self-deception and dishonesty. Of course, if I have the freedom to fit in certain situations, there are also chances that I will take advantage of it because I know that I can fit in any situation. Still, every moral theory has contradictory obligations that are detrimental to both reality and ethics theory. In actuality, people can successfully overcome them, but it cannot be claimed that having a standard in dealing with conflicting rights and duties should stop oneself from handling them. For example, there are certain standards with duties and such, but that does not mean that a person has the right to stop the other from doing so just because he or she feels that he or she does not have the capacity to properly handle it. Such that if utility is the main reason we do things, then utility can also help us decide what to do when we have conflicting duties. The utility standard may be hard to implement, but it is better than having no standard. In other systems, the moral laws all claim independent authority, and there is no one to settle the conflicts. When one is more important than the other, then it is just based on weak reasons, leaving room for personal desires unless the conflict is resolved due to considerations of utility. Moreover, if there is a conflict between secondary rules, then we only need to look back at the basic rules, since everything has smaller rules involved. But if there is really only one rule or there is no other way to solve it, then it should be prioritized. For example, my friends and I plan to go on vacation, but my job is on the line. So of course, it is clear that there are no more options for that and I should clearly prioritize my job.